This is the story of American freedom. By 1968, the war in Vietnam had reached a crescendo. The unpopularity of the war brought home a central fact of American history. Americans do not like fighting other people's wars unless the reasons for that war are clearly spelled out. Now, Woodrow Wilson did this in 1917. This was a war to end all wars. It was a war to make the world safe for democracy. And the boys who went to France believed that. In 1941, the reason could not be more clear. The United States had been attacked by Japan, and then war declared upon us by Germany. It was clearly a great crusade, as Dwight Eisenhower would say, to liberate the world. And the free men and women of the world were marching hand in hand to make sure such an evil as Nazism never threatened the world again. But Korea was much less clear, and even more unclear about it was that while these men were freezing in Korea, Americans at home went on with their lives as normal. And Vietnam was even more so. Now, the question of American colonialism had been raised after the Spanish-American War. And once again, the lessons of history should have given some advice to politicians like Lyndon Johnson. The United States had annexed Puerto Rico after its victory over Spain, given Cuba its freedom, but annexed the Philippines. Philippines did not want to be annexed. They had been fighting the Spaniards for years, and they were willing to fight the Americans, much the same way the Vietnamese had been fighting the French for years and now were willing to fight the Americans. And that war, after the Spanish-American War, was a cruel and drawn-out affair, a bloody war fought by an American professional army against Filipino patriots, a war in which both sides committed atrocities. And as word of this got back to America, there were many in Congress who raised their voice against America being engaged in a colonial war of imperialism. They argued that as imperialism had brought down the freedom of Rome, the Roman Republic, so imperialism would destroy the freedom of the United States. Now, we need to stop for a minute and define imperialism. But essentially, from the perspective of whether it's the Philippines or Vietnam, imperialism was the doctrine that you as a nation have the right to spread your values, your ideas to other countries, to take them over. Now, America was very much following in the path of France and Britain as a imperialistic power. They believed that France and Britain, they were bringing to India or to Indochina the values of European civilization, and that these values were far superior to the values of the Indians or of the Indochinese. And they were going to bring them whether the Indians or the Indo-Chinese wanted them or not. Now, there were other reasons. These countries offered markets for the goods of British and French merchants, but the noble aspect of it, as portrayed by the French and British, was bringing their values of civilization, of guided freedom to these peoples. And in that sense, that is what the United States saw itself doing, at least Lyndon Johnson, in Vietnam. Democracy was the best form of government. America was the model of a democracy. Communism was the antithesis of democracy. This was nothing but an attempt by China to impose communism, not just upon all of Vietnam, not just upon all of Southeast Asia, but upon all of Asia. And combined together with Soviet communism to dominate the world and to destroy the freedom of the United States. And the war grew ever more bloody and ever more divisive. But it did more than that. It unleashed an avalanche of social and political change. One mark of this was when a rather startled United States public heard in 1968 that Lyndon Johnson would not seek, nor would he accept the nomination of the Democratic Party. In other words, the war had driven him from office. He was eligible for another term. He had told some of his closest friends earlier on, well, I'm not going to let some pissant country destroy my presidency. Well, it had. Now, I believe, I teach this, that history is a story of great events, great ideas, great individuals. I believe that empires and nations rise and fall not because of deterministic factors, not because of the economy, not because of global warming. They fall because of individual mistakes made by individual leaders. And in these terms, Lyndon Johnson was one of the greatest failures in American history. I don't doubt that he saw himself as a patriot. He was willing to reach out and grasp the hand of his fellow African American citizens and aid them to freedom. He believed that the United States was the embodiment of freedom, of national freedom, of political freedom, of individual freedom. But he was guilty of hubris, of that Greek word that is overused and misunderstood today, but it means outrageous arrogance. That outrageous arrogance that leads you to destruction and those around you to destruction. It is brought upon you by a moral blindness. Ate, as the Greeks called it. You become so swollen with pride in yourself that you cannot see the wrong and the mistakes that you are committing. Nor are you willing to withdraw when a mistake should have been made clear to you. Johnson, coming from Texas, a master of the Senate, brought into the presidency by the tragic death of John Kennedy, and determined to be the best president in this country's history, and embracing major political ideas. First, that the war in Vietnam had to end in a complete American triumph and democracy established in that land, an American democracy. That, following in the footsteps of John Kennedy, we could go to the moon. We could conquer the moon, conquer space, and that we could abolish poverty. Jesus had already said that the poor you will have with you always, but Johnson knew more than Jesus. He could abolish poverty with his Great Society, building upon Franklin Roosevelt, whom we admire deeply. Franklin Roosevelt's Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And thus, he set about upon an enormous spending spree. Massive amounts of money. You cannot fight a war and go deeply into debt and carry out tremendously expensive programs at home. You must, as president, as a leader, exhibit the ability to set priorities. If Vietnam were the priority, then pour everything into it. If the Great Society were the priority, if helping Americans achieve some form of economic equality, then get out of Vietnam and forget about the moon. After all, the moon had been there for quite a while. Maybe it could stay on for a few more years without imposing American democracy upon it. But he couldn't see that in his moral blindness. And thus, he ran up a huge national debt and unbalanced budgets, heedless of the consequences that would have to be paid. But he unleashed other factors as well. For at home, the same idealistic young people that had had their faith in America revitalized by John Kennedy, who saw it as a shining bastion for the world, began to question this war in Vietnam and question it seriously. Now, some of these questions came out of self-interest. There's nothing wrong with self-interest. Students who did not want to be drafted to be sent to fight some war they did not understand. And Lyndon Johnson, with all of his rhetoric, in fact, he was once the teacher of rhetoric at a school in Texas. He could never explain to the American people why they were there. And as the press questioned it more and more, he found himself more and more at a loss. But Americans questioned it. The press questioned it. And then young people began to move on, to question every aspect of authority. And by 1968, this sweeping revolt against authority began to reach a new height and a new bitterness and divisiveness. Universities were questioned. Universities were taken over by campus radicals who found a large number of regular students supporting them. Campus radicals who saw themselves as new Lenins, leading the way to a social revolution. occupying the buildings, questioning courses, questioning the legitimacy of the vision of American history, American government, of literature that they had been fed, occupying libraries, demanding a change. Course evaluations began to appear. They would be the ultimate judges of whether a teacher was any good or not. Teachers had not wanted their authority questioned. Now it was questioned. But why should they not take drugs? Drugs enhanced your ability to see the world in a clear fashion. And the birth control pill, it's so prevalent today we don't think about it. But it unleashed a whole new morality. Sex was good. The more sex you had, the better it was. And the more partners you had, the better it was. Love should be free. Love was a way of reaching out and touching. And wearing a stiffly starched shirt and khakis to class? Well, one, you dressed the way you wanted to. You grew your hair long. That was a sign of your rebellion. And you grew a beard. But you didn't go to class anyway. You boycotted the classes. Or if you went, you shouted down these weak-kneed professors. And many of them were weak-kneed. They were sort of mild liberals. They were shouted down. I want to lecture on Tiberius Gracchus, the beginning of the fall of the Roman Republic. Students wouldn't listen. They would shout you down. Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh. Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh. Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh. The professor went back to his class and complained to his colleagues. Many of them said, well, you should be talking about Ho Chi Minh. We're not going to teach anymore. We're going to hold teach-ins where we become radicalized and learn from the students their radical view of American history. All wisdom lies with youth. But the Talmud, the Bible, they tell us that wisdom comes with old age. Well, only stupidity comes with old age. This is the title of one of the books of the era, The Greening of America. The young people were turning America into a new spring of freedom. And freedom was defined as the individual freedom to live absolutely as you chose. And you alone were responsible for whether you were harming anybody else or not. And the angry tunes of the generation, poets like Bob Dylan, sang of the evils of the present system. What's that gun you're toting, they said. And the world is going to change. The change is in the wind. And this was a generation that was going to overturn all values. They would decide what was moral and immoral on an individual basis. It was the end of the ideal of absolute right and absolute wrong. It was the way you defined it. The Declaration of Independence was a hypocritical statement by a bunch of wealthy slave owners to justify their grab for property. The Constitution, just one more successful attempt by wealthy slave owners to make sure all the money went into their pockets. Take a career in business and industry? Well, that was the worst thing in the world you could do. The corruption of Wall Street. It ought to be brought down in one huge mass. Social organization, that was the way of the future. Radicalize the poor. Radicalize the current generation of university students. And they would turn into professors who would continue this radical deconstruction of all American values. And so they did. University faculties began to hire professors who wrote about revolution throughout the world, who rode motorcycles to class and wore black leather jackets and paraded their radicalism. And this revolt against authority became chaos, riots in the streets. The Democratic Convention of 1968 was a thoroughgoing mob riot in which the police were eager enough to bash the head of these hippies and these young women who didn't refrain from using some of the most coarse language and calling these policemen obscene names. And America watched horrified at this very concept of political freedom in the form of a convention was all but destroyed by this rising anarchy. And many of these young radicals were not afraid to call themselves anarchist. And cities in the United States burned. Could you have imagined that in 1960? Los Angeles, Boston, going up in flames. And then presidential leadership reached its absolute nadir. Amidst this time of a bitterly divided nation, why, if you walked home from your graduate class with long hair, the workers building a new structure next to where you live would shout at you, hippie, 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 and come down after you with their wrenches, and you would flee for your life just for wearing your hair a little long and growing a most handsome beard as I did. Thus, amidst all this time of chaos, Martin Luther King, on April the 4th, 1968, was assassinated. And not long afterwards, Robert Kennedy, who promised to take up his brother's torch to bring the country back together again, on his way to the Democratic nomination and to the presidency, was assassinated by an unknown assassin. No, we have somebody who we say did it, but an unknown assassin. Was there nothing that this country would not endure and suffer? And thus, the 1968 election, what would have seemed impossible in 1960? Richard Nixon was elected with a promise to end the war in Vietnam. But if he told the electorate before he was elected, why, it wouldn't work, so he had to keep it a secret. Well, of course, the secret was he was going to let the war drag on, more and more American boys die, until he was reelected. And then, ultimately, a negotiated peace and one of the most dishonorable scenes in American history. An American army defeated and crowds scrambling for those few remaining helicopters, leaving behind thousands of Vietnamese who had tried to be loyal to the United States to be murdered. And then Watergate. It revealed the presidency as, in the hands of Richard Nixon, a cheap, tawdry instrument for vindictiveness and self-aggrandizement. It demonstrated above all, as had the war in Vietnam, the power of the press to make and break a president. A president who lied to the country on TV, showed them this massive array of tapes, and said, "Now I promise you, There's not a word in those tapes that showed that I knew anything about a cover-up of Watergate. They were filled with his knowledge of Watergate and his remarkable profanity as well, and his racism. And so he left office in disgrace. Gerald Ford was his successor. He'd been briefly vice president. An honest and decent and patriotic American. I'm always touched when I visit the Gerald Ford Museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He tried to bring the country together, and the press just took this dislike to him. He wanted to bring our long national nightmare to an end, but he was accused of hypocrisy himself in granting an amnesty to Richard Nixon. He was the most athletic man ever to be president. He was offered a pro football scholarship. Did you know that? But the press turned him into a stumblebum. And he missed his opportunity for true greatness. He should not have run again in 1976. He should have announced at the start of his presidency that he would not run again. But he ran, and he lost to Jimmy Carter. And then the great collapse began. An economic collapse, an energy collapse that led to huge lines of automobiles at gas stations, an energy crisis so severe that President Carter didn't even cut on the lights, the Christmas lights at the White House. An American people that felt its moral authority, its military authority was collapsing. We believed we had never lost a war. We had lost Vietnam. A president who proclaimed his humanitarian views and sat by while 2 million Cambodians were murdered by their own government. And then the sacred American soil of our embassy in Iran invaded, taken over, and American diplomats, contrary to all international law, held as hostages. And the United States, so feeble that when it attempted a military rescue, saw its helicopters tumble disastrously into the desert. And then, at this lowest point, who would have imagined that a Savior would come forth from Hollywood? Ronald Reagan, a man who spoke with absolute conviction and belief of the true American values, of patriotism, of honesty, of integrity, of truth, and with the ability to take this chaos and restore order. For 8 years, proving that wisdom comes with old age, not with youth. He was our oldest president. Values shaped in Hollywood by the films he had made. Good American films with good American values. Teaching that Americans always win, and win honestly, and are good sports. The press never liked him, but he was masterful with the press. He had served as governor of California, and he had put an end to these student riots. He went right there on campus. And he said, "Mr. Professor, why aren't you in class?" We're going to have a teach-in. No, you just had a teach-out. You're fired. Your contract says you're supposed to teach that class. Come here to me, boy. Campus radical. Do you know that you are a Tarzan movie all in yourself? Why, you wear your hair like Tarzan. You walk like Jane. And you smell like Cheetah. So he had set California in order, and there was nothing he could not do with the United States. Oh, he had common sense. He sought to intervene in the Middle East, and then when a terrorist attack killed a number of our Marines, pondered the issue and got out. But Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, he was the great terrorist. Everyone was afraid of him. Reagan solved him, sent in a few jets and bombed his complex. And Gaddafi began to settle down. But it was the economy that Reagan made as his first order, and the prosperity he restored out of that economic chaos, the end to the energy crisis, an America in which people were working again and were prosperous again and believed in their economy, a belief in capitalism. That was his first order of the day. Now, it's never totally clear how he did all of this, and there certainly was a good deal of growth in government and a lot of government expenditures. And some might say he was using the methods of John Maynard Keynes while mouthing the idea of a free market. Maybe, but it worked. And in fact, when he went before the press and they said, "Mr. President, how are your economic policies working?" He said, "Well, boys and girls, they must be working pretty well because you've stopped calling them Reaganomics and just calling them economics." So that was his first priority. But the second, that was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union. The Carter presidency saw the Soviet Union the height of its power, a mighty navy, a massive army, massive numbers of nuclear weapons, engaged in a war in Afghanistan, determined to spread communism all over the world, seemingly invincible, so much so that in 1980, wise historians were writing that the 21st century would be the century of the Soviet Union, triumphant as the great superpower. Well, Reagan wasn't impressed. He saw a country that couldn't feed its own people. He saw an army bogged down in a war in Afghanistan that they were losing. And he saw a country that was bankrupt. So he talked directly in the strongest terms to the Soviet leadership and said, "You know, we're going to build a complex over our nation, a setup that will stop any of your missiles. You will be unable to penetrate this missile shield we're going to set up." And the Soviet leadership realized they didn't have the money for this. Well, probably we didn't either, but he called their bluff. And the Soviet Union began to collapse. So in 8 years, Reagan restored the economy, brought down that evil empire as he saw it, began the collapse of the evil totalitarian regimes throughout Eastern Europe, and restored hope and confidence to the American people. They were once again proud of their country. And that pride would be bolstered by the sense that we were the only superpower in the world, and we were the richest country in the world again. And that American freedom meant our national greatness, a political freedom that could bring forth a Ronald Reagan and a Congress that would work with him, and an individual freedom in which the ordinary American lived his life as he chose, as long as he harmed no one else. But that life was lived without fear of crime. It was lived in cities that were orderly, on university campuses that got back to their business of teaching, and an individual freedom that promised we would be better off year after year after year after year. A resurgence of the American story of freedom.
The Story of Freedom in America with Dr. J. Rufus Fears is made possible by the generous support of our freedom and heritage sponsors. The Story of Freedom in America is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma, in partnership with the Alumni Association of the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.